Strategic Posture for a New Era, introducing the Congressional Strategic Posture Commission report. My name is Matthew Kranig, and I'm Vice President at the Atlantic Council and Senior Director of the Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. This event comes at a time of significant deterioration in the international security environment. For decades, Russia was the only nuclear peer competitor to the United States. But in recent years, China has launched a rapid and far-reaching nuclear buildup and is on pace to have 1,500 nuclear weapons by 2035. This means that for the first time in its history, the United States will need to contend with two nuclear peer competitors, Russia and China, at the same time. Moreover, the risk of conflict with these revisionist powers is growing. To address this unprecedented challenge, Congress established a Strategic Posture Commission in the 2022 National Defense Authorization Act. Congress charged the commission to, quote, conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure, and factors affecting the strategic stability of near-peer competitors of the United States. Today's event will examine the major findings and recommendations from the final report of the Strategic Posture Commission. Convenings like this are central to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and the world. The center also honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service. 40 years ago, in 1983, General Scowcroft chaired the President's Commission on Strategic Forces, better known today as the Scowcroft Commission. In many ways, this 1983 report set the basis for the bipartisan consensus in strategic forces policy that continues to this day. The Scowcroft Center is proud to carry on this legacy. Among other events and publications on strategic forces, we were proud to host an official rollout of the Biden administration's Nuclear Posture Review in 2022. Within the Scowcroft Center, our strategic forces work is run through our Forward Defense program. Forward Defense generates ideas and connects stakeholders in the defense ecosystem to promote an enduring military advantage for the United States, its allies, and partners. We will begin today with the Commissioner panel. I'm pleased to welcome the Chair and Vice Chair of the Commission, Madeleine Creedon and Senator John Kyle, and fellow Commissioner Robert Scher. I was honored to serve as Commissioner, and I will also join this panel, which will be moderated by Michael Gordon, National Security Correspondent with the Wall Street Journal. Before serving as chair of this commission, Madeleine Creedon was previously the Principal Deputy Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration at the Department of Energy and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs. Senator Kyle represented Arizona in the U.S. Senate from 1995 to 2013, and he served as on the Armed Services Committee for many years and was an influential voice for nuclear modernization. Bob Scher served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities in the Pentagon and is now Head of International Affairs for BP America. We will then proceed to a second panel in which we seek reactions to the report from outside experts. Our outside experts will include Dr. Rob Sufer, a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy, Lynn Ruston, Vice President of the Global Nuclear Policy Program at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and the Honorable Walt Slocum, Board Director here at the Atlantic Council and former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. This session will be moderated by Tara Koop, Pentagon Correspondent Pentagon Correspondent at the Associated Press. We're grateful and excited for you all to be here with us today. Both panels will include audience question and answer, in which attendees both in person and virtually will be able to participate. To submit a question, please go to askac.org. This event is public and on the record. Thank you again very much for joining. I hope you enjoy the conversation. And now I'd like to turn over to Michael Gordon to moderate our first panel.
Well, I think we have a very important event here, and this report that was done by the Commission has already gotten a lot of attention in Washington among the people who follow these sorts of developments. But I think in the broader country at large, I'm not sure everybody knows that much about it, really. They only testified to the Congress really just this week. So this is an opportunity for me to ask some specific questions about the report, but also for the commissioners to introduce some of their important findings and explain the logic behind them. I'm going to ask some questions, get a discussion going for about 40 minutes or so, and then turn it to the audience or who are submitting questions and give them an opportunity to ask their own very specific questions. So they'll have that chance. First off, we're all informal here. Madeline, can you, you think the main message of the report? It's a very detailed report well over 100 pages. But what's the main message? What do you think the American public really needs to take away from this document at this particular point in time?
Thanks, Michael. I guess I should also add that, yes, it is a long report, and it does have 81 some recommendations. But the key important parts of this report are that over the last several years, we have evolved, the threat has evolved to a condition where the U.S. is not really prepared, and we hadn't planned for the situation that we find ourselves in. And so the idea behind the report is that we need to get serious about this threat, and we need to take actions now so that we can prepare and have the flexibility to be able to address the threat as it evolves over the next several years.
Even though we're informal, I'm going to address you as Senator Kyle, because it just is in my DNA. But one of the big themes in the report is that the United States is not sufficiently prepared to deal with an environment in which it will confront two nuclear peers. We're not there yet. The report on China military power said there are about 500 operational warheads, but we're headed in that direction. I think a lot of ordinary Americans and normal people would say, well, what do you mean we're not prepared? We have 1,550 New START accountable strategic nuclear warheads. We have a nuclear triad. We have all sorts of manner of forces and that would seem to have some deterrence value. In what way are we not prepared for this new era?
Thank you, Michael. The simple way to approach the answer is we have prepared a force structure to deal with the one country that we thought we might have to deal with nuclear weapons. That's Russia. And the two countries, Russia and the United States, basically negotiated a force structure for each country that set limits on how many nuclear weapons we could deploy. That's how many we thought were necessary. Now we have another party entering the game here, and China says that it wants to be in parity with both Russia and the United States, which means that no longer will there be only one country with the warheads that the Russians have, but now there will be two. And it's troublesome because we know that Russia and China desire to act in concert. They have acted in concert to some extent. And with respect to a potential confrontation with the United States, we can't ignore the possibility that either those two countries acting together, planning to act together in concert, or if one starts something and we have to deal with it in one part of the world, the other could see it as an opportunity for that second country to get involved, in which case we would then be faced with the prospect of not having one war on our hands, but potentially two. And we are not prepared to fight a two-war scenario simultaneously.
So, I don't know which panelist wants to take this, maybe Bob, but one criticism that's been made, or observation that's been made of this report by some in the arms control community, is that it could further fuel the arms race. And if the U.S. feels that it's imperative to build up above current levels, surely the Chinese and the Russians might add even further to their holdings. Is that a fair critique? And how can you reinforce deterrence without leading to an unending arms race? I think Jake Sullivan gave a speech last June where he said the future nuclear force doesn't need to be equivalent to the combined total of what Russia and China has in order to have deterrence value.
And I think many, if not all, commissioners would agree with that this is not a simple additive problem. We have two, as Senator Kyle pointed out, we have two threats, two arsenals that we're looking at into the future, but that doesn't mean that the answer is necessarily just doubling what we have now. And in terms of the arms control piece, I think all of us spent a lot of time thinking about this as commissioners, but to me, one of the important pieces is to look at we had a structure that has been fairly consistent for decades. We have a structure that we have set through treaty that we kept to, and that our modernization program, in fact, was looking at a one-for-one replacement. During that time, Russia has looked to get new and novel and increase its strategic nuclear posture and its weapons. China has clear plans to increase and has increased. So to some extent, saying that we are fueling an arms race because we are looking at the new reality that's coming into the near future and saying we must do more, I think is missing the point that we were actually fairly consistent and concerned about that, maintained the levels that in fact we thought were appropriate. And the things we were trying to not spark in Russia and China, they're doing anyway. So I'd like to push back a little bit on that critique, which is it fueling an arms race? It was happening without us doing anything, and at this point it'd be irresponsible for us to assume that they won't continue on the path they have clearly laid forward.
So I'd like to ask about one particular formulation in the report, and going down the line, Matt, in the actual document there's a very carefully written sentence that says the U.S. defense strategy to address the two nuclear peer threat requires a U.S. nuclear force that is either larger in size, different in composition, or both. And then it says, therefore, decisions must be made now. So the Commission didn't quite go so far as to say we have to increase our forces, although all of the recommendations about having a planned larger B-21 force or more Columbia-class submarines or more long-range cruise missiles seem to point in that direction. Can you explain that formulation to me? What are you really saying? Is the Commission really saying we need to have more forces, or is it stopping just short of that?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Michael. And so I'll just quote directly from the report. And one thing I'd like to highlight is the strategy for people who haven't read the report. We do say that the United States needs a defense strategy that can deter and, if necessary, defeat Russia and China simultaneously. Second, we say that America's traditional nuclear strategy, the fundamentals are sound. We don't need a fundamental rethink of the strategy, but we just need to adjust our posture to deal with this new two-peer reality. And so what we say is that the program of record that we planned in 2010 is necessary and should be pursued with urgency, but it's not sufficient. We need to do more. And so some of the specific recommendations, we say prepare to upload some or all of the nation's hedge warheads, plan to deploy Sentinel ICBMs in a MIRV configuration, increase the planned number of deployed long-range standoff weapons, increase the planned number of B-21 bombers and tankers, increase the planned production of Columbia SSBNs, and their Trident ballistic missile systems, and plan to put the bomber fleet on strip alert. And so none of those things. So we don't need an increase in the size of the arsenal immediately, but we do need to take steps now that would give us flexibility in the future. And I think that's where there's unanimous consent among the Commission that if we don't take those steps now, we won't have the option in the future. We also call for, just some things that are notable, we call for additional theater nuclear weapons in the Indo-Pacific and in Europe. And then also for the first time, we call for a missile defense, homeland missile defense for Russia and China to deter and defeat their so-called coercive attacks. So I do think there are some notable changes from what we were thinking would be necessary when we planned the program of record back in 2010.
So let me ask you about those. It was very helpful for you to go down that list. Let me ask you about some of those specific recommendations. The recommendation that the U.S. needs to have an air and missile defense against Russia and China is a bit of a departure. I mean, the previous concept would be we needed to have very limited defense against so-called rogue states like North Korea, that there was not any real utility in having missile defense against Russia and China. They could easily overwhelm it. But now you're saying we do need something like that because of coercive scenarios. And I noted in the recent China military power report released yesterday at the Pentagon, they talk about a possible Chinese program to develop an intercontinental range, conventionally armed ballistic missile. What are the coercive scenarios that you're worried about, and how would a air missile defense, protect against that. Who wants to take that here?
Well, I'll start, and because I think we
Yeah.
all have a view on this.
Yeah.
And needless to say, amongst our many robust discussions, this was one of them. But one of the things that is very important, and I don't want to leave the impression that we've changed the nature of the ground-based interceptors. Those ground-based interceptors are not what we're really talking about here. What we're talking about here are looking at where there is key critical infrastructure, where there are key bases, those sorts of things, and to think about how we would protect those with integrated air and missile defense systems, so point defenses, theater defenses, those sorts of things, so that if Russia or China were trying to keep us out of something, right? They want to do something over here, they want to keep the US out, that coercive attack to keep us out, to prevent us from doing anything, would not be effective. In other words, we would have a deterrent capability, so that we just want to take that off the table. I mean, so that's part of what we were thinking. So it's not as stark as reversing decades of missile defense policy with respect to defending against Russia. It's a very focused. It's very limited.
If I could just add one other thing. One of the reasons we were able to discuss this is because of the advances in technology from the time 20 or 30 years ago when we were first thinking about missile defenses, and it was such a daunting task because of what the offense from a then Soviet Union could throw at us, and it would be very costly. Now, with the cost of boosting satellites much, much less than it ever was before, the commercial sector putting literally thousands of satellites into orbit, for example, we see opportunities for using all domains, potentially, including the space domain, for developing a system which really could be effective, at least against a limited or coercive kind of attack. And therefore, what we urge is for the Defense Department to do a full-up RDT&E effort, not just research and development. And if they find a system that's feasible to do this, to urgently get it deployed.
And while I don't feel like we need to all respond to every question, I think missile defense
This
is
one is
certainly
one.
one where, as Madeline previewed, I would just like to add on to that, that certainly this was one of the more meaty discussions that we had, but also looking at a couple of things I wanted to just footstop and add to. One is there are a lot of people who think, missile defense, that's destabilizing, look at what, that creates these problems. And I guess I'd argue, if you look around Moscow, the air and missile defense protections around Moscow have always been quite strong. Russia doesn't think it's necessarily a problem to have that. For looking at us and figuring out, are there critical infrastructure pieces that we should be looking to make sure to protect, where you couldn't have a limited attack and then prompt a larger war, or have a limited attack and have your adversary think, it's limited enough. They won't have a full-scale war because of this. Those are the kind of things we're looking to do. And the technology piece, I think that Senator Kyle said, is also critical for this, which is we're not saying what we have is exactly right for every missile defense purpose that we're looking at in the future. We're not looking at more. There's a big problem with some parts of our missile defense where it's a lot more expensive to have an interceptor than it is to have a missile. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that cost curve. So let's look at technology. Let's look at other things that are out there to potentially help with this problem, which is in fact only getting worse.
So Matt, I'd like to ask, among the other recommendations, and it's been noted by the panel already, is that the U.S. should have a theater nuclear capability in the Asia Pacific. But I'd like to ask the logic of that, to explain that a little more, because in the Trump administration NDS, it called for a sea-launched cruise missile nuclear capability, but it certainly wasn't treated as an urgent priority during the Trump administration. My recollection is it was a good decade away before that kind of capability would have been fielded. And also, in the Trump administration national defense strategy, it was even suggested that it could be traded away if the Russians made certain concessions on INF. Of course, that treaty is now gone. And more recently, at Stratcom, General Cotton has said there should be at least the possibility of a theater system and not necessarily a sea-launched cruise missile. Why do we need a theater nuclear system in the Asia Pacific at this time, and how could we achieve it, since the Biden administration has said they don't want to do a sea-launched cruise missile, and you'd be asking them to reverse that policy, and how important and urgent is this?
Yeah, so I'll start with kind of the deterrence theory and the history, and then get to the current day and our recommendation. So flexible response has been a part of U.S. nuclear strategy for many decades, starting in the Cold War. And the logic is we don't want to put ourselves in a position where our choices are suicide or surrender. If the adversary conducts a limited nuclear attack, we want options other than surrendering and launching a full-scale nuclear attack. So by having those flexible options, we can threaten to respond in a limited way if an adversary were to conduct a limited attack. And the purpose, of course, is not to fight the limited nuclear war, but for the adversary to see that we have response options and be deterred in the first place. So we had a lot of these theater nuclear weapons during the Cold War. At the end of the Cold War, we got rid of almost all of them. But Russia and China haven't. Russia and China have retained and are building more non-strategic nuclear weapons. China has hundreds or thousands of short and intermediate and medium-range nuclear-capable missiles in Asia. Russia has 2,000 or so non-strategic nuclear weapons. We know Russia has this kind of scary escalate to de-escalate doctrine that we've seen him threaten nuclear use in Ukraine. He could do the same thing in NATO. And so we want to be able to deter that kind of attack against a NATO ally. And same thing in the Asia theater. China could have incentives to use nuclear coercion or limited nuclear threats, and we want to have an effective response to that. And so the Commission calls for theater-based nuclear weapons in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and we have a number of characteristics we think those capabilities should have: low yield, survivability, et cetera, but we don't pick winners and losers. So slick them in could be an answer to that, but there may be other answers.
What might the other answers be?
Well, other answers might be, if you go back to the Cold War, we had a lot of different systems. So there could be a lot of different things. I know some people have talked about having a ground-launched capability. Now that the United States is out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that could be an option. I think some experts might say that some of the systems that we have planned, maybe bombers or fighter aircraft with gravity bombs or cruise missiles, could maybe fit that description. So again, we didn't want to pick winners and losers. We just wanted to describe the capabilities that we thought we needed for deterrence in those regions.
An important feature of this report is it's not merely about nuclear weapon systems. It's really about strategic posture. So it's about conventional capabilities as well. And in that respect, the report is very critical of the Pentagon's One War framework, which has now been embraced in two national defense strategies, one during the Trump administration in 2018, and then one by the Biden administration in 2022. And there was a reason that they embraced it. They were well aware that things could happen simultaneously in different areas, but they just thought it was, if you were really going to fully fund a two-war strategy with all the logistics and the transport that would be involved, it would eat into the cutting-edge capabilities that one really needs to stay ahead of our competitors. I'd like to ask you, Bob, you said that a two-war strategy doesn't mean twice the spending, but what does a two conventional war capability really mean when you spell it out in terms of programs, spending, capability? What does that really entail?
Sure. Well, you've hit on one of my pet peeves as a defense planner, which before coming to the nuclear world, that was where I spent a lot of my time. And it is important to be able to separate planning and what you do for planning and what you do for scenarios to develop the conventional force and the nuclear force. So you don't actually, these are separate things, although they often are conflated. And I lived through many of the 2MRC strategy and the 2MTW strategy. And if you don't know those acronyms, you don't have to care about it. But what's important is that what the Department of Defense needs to look at, and what we've argued for, is that, look, they know that there are two major adversaries going on. They know that we may have to fight that kind of a war. What we're looking at is in terms of building the structure what can you fund successfully? What do you think you need to do in terms of setting out the conditions? And then separately, we do a process in the Pentagon that looks at saying, okay, how do you use these forces that we have? What do you want to be able to do, and how do you fill the gaps? And I think one of the things we talked about in the report is it isn't just about conventional forces. It has never been. We have never planned just about conventional forces. So part of what the point that we try to make is, so if you are not willing to invest more in conventional forces, then you are recognizing that you have to have a greater reliance on nuclear forces. Now, in general, that's not something we want to do. We would like to lessen the importance of nuclear forces in our strategy. It's never going to get to zero, in my opinion, but we want to lessen it. But if you don't make the investments in the conventional side, then you necessarily have to look more to what you're doing on the nuclear side. And I think that's the message we were trying to send, is that you can't disentangle these two pieces, that you have to look at them together. It's a difficult challenge. It's a costly challenge. We do have a very large defense budget. We have to figure out a way to make sure that we do all of this, but it's got to be built against the threats we actually have. And that's why that threat section of the report is so important, to highlight that that threat is changing, not just in the conventional side, but also on the nuclear side.
In the past, strategic nuclear modernization and arms control have been linked. They've certainly been linked politically and conceptually. I mean, New START was ratified because there was an extensive nuclear modernization program. And I think this connection is important to maintain public support and support in the Congress. An impression I have from this report, though, is that the programmatic details and recommendations, which are very interesting and usefully very specific, are more extensive than the discussion of diplomatic options and arms control approaches that the U.S. might take, recognizing that the two-tier problem is a very complex one when you have no U.S.-Russian talks going on at all, and the Chinese unwilling so far to engage in strategic discussions. But how might the U.S. approach arms control and diplomacy to mitigate these threats, both to reduce the dangers to the United States, but also to reestablish that link that's been so important over the decades, so that you can go to the Congress and go to the American people and say, well, yes, we're modernizing our arsenal and enlarging it, if you follow your recommendations, but we're also dealing with a threat through diplomacy and arms control. How do these things go together? What's your vision of arms control? Would it be three-way arms control, two-way arms control, confidence-building measures? Madeline, can you take that on?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I do want to point out that in the report, there is an entire chapter that addresses risk reduction. So part of our discussions with how do you think about arms control in the future, we have to think a little more creatively. It isn't just a single strategic arms treaty. We have to think about the broad range of things that actually reduce the risk. So it's confidence building measures, it's strategic stability talks. I would love to see, if it were possible, military to military talks, the way that there were with Russia years ago. Anything that has the opportunity, norm building, we should really explore all of this. One of the other things that again, we supported a lot is to be ready for arms control, to be ready for the verifiable mutual agreements. You know, hopefully it's going to be a trilateral agreement, but do the research, the development, have the Department of Energy, have NNSA, have DOD understand what it is that they would need to have a tri-party agreement and how it would be verified, how they would do the inspections. And that would also then help in terms of thinking about what you would want to do. Obviously, it's a huge challenge because everybody wants to see total stockpile numbers. And to be meaningful, it really has to be tri-party. I mean, it might work if you had multiple bilateral, but I think that would be terribly confusing. But we have to figure out how to do this. And maybe with the thinking that we've put forth in this report about thinking about strategic, that it's not just nuclear, it really is strategic deterrence, maybe there will come a time, I hope there will come a time when China's ready.
Go ahead.
If I could just add on that, and Madeline's last comment gets at this, when China is ready. Arms control, of course, requires a partner, and China hasn't been willing to engage in serious arms control talks. Russia has suspended compliance with the New START treaty, so real questions about what happens when New START expires. So I think that this isn't in the report speaking for myself. I think arms control agreements with Russia and China would be terrific. It's just really hard to imagine anything in the near term. And so I think that's why the report focused more on risk reduction measures, missile launch notifications, other things like that to put predictability and stability into the relationship, even if what we've thought of as the core of arms control over the past several decades, numerical limits on numbers of warheads is difficult in the near future. We do, however, put forward one concrete idea for a new arms control arrangement. China has conducted this fractional orbital bombardment system. We see that as very destabilizing, and so we argue that the United States should try to negotiate a ban on these FOBs systems.
Mm-hmm. And what would the United States give China in return for that ban?
We'd agree not to develop a FOB system of our own, which would be very threatening to China.
I do think that in the arms control sphere, and I'm not the specialist, but even though Russia's suspended participation in New START, it's important to note that they're adhering to the limits of New START, and they've made that point publicly, that they intend to continue adhering to them to the life of the treaty. They're doing test notifications, and even though their Duma recently rescinded ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, an agreement the U.S. has not ratified, they don't appear at this point to be resuming moving toward nuclear testing. There's questions about their compliance, so they haven't thrown the entire framework out the window at this point in time. There's one question I think that a lot of people have is, one really important, the value of the report is it's so specific in terms of a lot of its recommendations across a whole number of different areas, the nuclear weapons infrastructure, plans to enlarge our strategic forces if we need be, B-21, specific recommendations on conventional forces. There's how many recommendations?
81.
81, but a lot of them have to do with things that we can do in terms of weapons programs or the infrastructure that supports them. But a question that I'm sure you get when you're on the Hill and from others is, you've done a pretty good job of laying out the threat. You've laid out a whole menu of ways to address the threat, but in an environment in which of constrained resources, in which it appears unlikely that all of these things are going to be funded, what are the priorities here? Senator, what are the priorities? Which are the programs that should go first, and which are the programs that should be pursued if we be nice to have but less essential? And how should we proceed?
There's one point we haven't made yet today, and that is that our report is a consensus report of 12 people that were appointed by the leadership of the Congress on both sides of the aisle. This was, I think, a fairly remarkable proposition. And the writ that we were given by the Congress was to answer a whole series of questions that they asked and give us our recommendations on what should be done. The writ did not include, by the way, would you cost it all out and then list all the things in the order in which you think they should be done? Obviously, that's Congress's prerogative, and that's what they're going to do. So our approach was to say, you asked for what you think we ought to do, here it is. Now, I would argue that there is nothing in what we've recommended that we can't afford. So it's up to the Congress to decide what the number one priority of the United States is. Well, our secretaries of defense and chairman of the Joint Chiefs have, for the last couple of decades at least, all testified to Congress that the number one priority for the defense of the country is this strategic deterrent. And the nuclear deterrent is a component, the key component of that. They describe that as the foundation for everything else. If that is the number one priority, then by definition, it tells you as a Congress or an administration, these are the things that you need to fund first. And then if you can do some other things, then go ahead and do that. And I would argue that with that as the number one principle, and secondly, understanding that we are only spending about half as much as we did during the buildup of the 1980s, for example, on defense. We're just around 3%, barely, of our gross domestic product. That clearly we can afford these things. And so our thinking has to change from, well, here's a top line, what can we cram in it, to how much do we need to deter war? The object here is to prevent another war, particularly with enemies who have nuclear capabilities.
Can I add one thing to that?
Please.
The report really, it's for the long game. So it's not do everything in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. A lot of the things that we recommend, because they've just started the manufacture, like the B-21, they're years down the road before you go beyond the 100 that are now there. The submarine, the same thing. It's years before you're going to get that other one. So this is a long game in terms of thinking about what are the requirements for deterrence. And the executive branch, Congress, should, we hope, take our report, look at the long-term, near-term, mid-term things we recommended, and think about how they start doing those things now. One of our biggest concerns was that in some number of years, when, assuming the threat continues on the same course that it is, there are going to have to be some serious decisions made. If we don't take steps now, then those decisions can't be made because there's not going to be anything to decide. And we just want to make sure that the planning has started, the research has started, the thinking has started, the funding has started, so that whoever is making those decisions can actually make a decision and not be foreclosed. So we don't want to foreclose options that might be needed in the future. Obviously, we'd all like Russia and China to change their course, and we wouldn't need these things, but we want to be prepared.
I was remiss, and I should have pointed out that the time period that you're addressing is 2027 to 2035.
35. And
But
some of this is really beyond it, actually.
Really, it is. A
Yeah.
lot of it is. But what your message is, move now to be prepared for that later. Perhaps all of this won't be necessary if the threat environment changes, but unfortunately, much of it might be. I think that's your message. So you've briefed. The Biden administration is in the middle of its own nuclear employment guidance review. They must have heard you out. What's been their response to these recommendations? What sort of feedback are you getting from them? And where do you think they're going in their own review?
Well, obviously, they have a lot on their plate these days, not only their own review, but everything else that's going on in the world. And we have not heard from them. But also, we only rolled this report out last week. And we just did the hearing before Senate Armed Services Committee yesterday. We did pre-brief them, so they knew they had an inkling of what was coming. We pre-briefed the Weapons Council, we pre-briefed the White House and others, so they knew it was coming. But it's a long report, and frankly, they need a little time to digest it because we have a lot of taskings that basically we've laid at their door.
You've been on the Hill, Senator, yesterday, right?
Yes.
And what was the response there? And there was an open session and a closed session. What kind of, there was what, the Senate?
It was the Senate
Well,
Armed
there's no
Services
House,
Committee.
but
Right.
where the problem is.
Yeah.
But, so you addressed the body where the problem isn't.
Right.
But what has been the response?
Well,
you get?
the Senate Armed Services Committee was one of the committees that generated the requirement for our commission.
Right.
So they were anxious to receive our recommendations. It was apparent, it was very well attended, and it was apparent to me that they had been very well staffed because they had a lot of very specific questions. Many were similar to the questions you've asked here today. And I thought they got right to the point. I think that it was well received by the majority of the members there. And it is my perception that there is there's a possibility for a lot of bipartisan agreement, at least in the Senate Armed Services Committee here. I think perhaps they're thinking, gee, if our commission of 12 very disparate people could render a consensus report with this degree of specificity and the amount of things that we're talking about here, maybe we can get together and come up with a consensus. And one of our recommendations, by the way, was that the Congress and the administration ought to arrive at a consensus on all of these things and then take the case to the American people, because they will need the support of the American people, particularly if we're going to have to spend more money on these things. So there hasn't been a lot of that in the past. I was happy to see the president speak to the nation last night to try to justify a particular some asks that he was making. That's important for the president to do. The Congress needs to do that too. And that was one of our specific recommendations.
Well, the administration hasn't blessed your report. It did enable it, right? Can you, one of you please explain, you got briefings from, it seems like, just about everybody under the sun who does this in the intelligence community and elsewhere. Matt, maybe you can explain the scope of what the input that you received and from what type of people and over what period. I think this report was, what, a year in the making, or how long was it in the making?
Yeah, we had our first meeting in the summer of 22 and just finished the report, so more than a year, and an enormous number of briefings from DoD, the intelligence community, outside experts, Department of Energy, and so I can defer to the chair and the vice chair to say anything that they would like to say, but the administration was cooperative and wanted to make sure that we had the information we needed to carry out our mission.
We also talked to allies, and that's also another very important aspect of this report. We had some really good conversations with different allies.
Okay. At this point, I think I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions, because I'm sure there'll be a few, and if there aren't enough, I'll throw in some of my own. But let me administer this iPad. So, here's a question. How much emphasis should command and control arrangements be given in terms of strengthening strategic posture? For example, we've seen Russia and China develop and test weapons such as hypersonic glide vehicles that pose potential problems for early warning systems. What recommendations does the report make, if any, for strengthening command and control to deal with the nuclear threats that Russia and China will pose in the near future?
One of the things we did, by the way, was to visit the Strategic Command in Nebraska, and were briefed there. In fact, went through an exercise to show how our command and control system really works. We also were briefed on the well, I'll be careful here. There is a classified annex to our report, and there are discussions in there that would also go to this question. But throughout the report, where we talk about the modernization of our nuclear enterprise, we include in that all of the command and control elements that need to be modernized. Now, many of them are in the current plan of record. The plan that probably will extend out another decade or so, but which will bring all elements of our nuclear enterprise and our strategic posture up to date, and that includes a lot of new command and control components. We also recommend that there be some strengthening of that for the new threats because of the entry of China into this construct and the developments that the Russians have developed. Because of this, of the hypersonic weapons, for example, you end up with a situation where you have far less warning of a potential attack. How do we deal with that? And situations where our command and control could be jeopardized at the very beginning of a conflict. How do we deal with that? Those are things that are included in our recommendations.
And if I could add, the question was about command and control, but the part of the question was about early warning. And so we do have a number of recommendations directed to improving our ability to see things like hypersonic and cruise missiles, looking at space-based sensor layers and things like that to give U.S. leaders and military commanders better situational awareness of the different threats that they face.
And also important in this one is the whole idea of having resilience and having redundancy so that you're not always reliant on one thing, like one early warning system, one command and control system, and obviously we have that. It's hard to go into a lot of the details, obviously, because so much of it's classified. But the other piece of this is, particularly on some of the early warning, is really looking at new technologies and how to get new technologies into the Defense Department faster.
So another question. This is from a person at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, whose name I'll murder if I pronounce it, but I'll try anyway. Jiri Lavikainen. Apologies for that. Can our panelists elaborate on what does the Commission hope to see from the NATO alliance and NATO's nuclear planning in terms of dealing with the two-peer threat environment, and how do they envision countering Russia's advantage in theater nuclear forces? What needs to change?
So I think a number of us on the commission, a fairly high percentage actually had the responsibility to oversee some of the NATO nuclear planning. So look, the first thing is to emphasize a point that Madeline made, which is the importance of allies. We brought them in to hear them. We wanted to know how they viewed this. We wanted to understand what they thought was important out of the U.S. strategic posture. And that was something that was critical to us, and the report, I think, is very clear of the importance of allies. I think as you get to the nuclear piece for NATO, we have a very strong and long-standing approach to how we plan for how we plan to use nuclear weapons, the theater nuclear weapons that we have in NATO. And there are some countries that are sort of frontline states when it comes to participating in the nuclear mission. And then we have other countries, in fact, all the other countries can have a role in this. And in fact, almost every country in NATO is a part of the nuclear planning group that looks at how we go forward and how you can work together to ensure that the nuclear pieces of the plan are integrated into a broader defense plan. And that's always the important piece, is this is not just about nuclear. You've got to be able to synchronize it with how you're thinking about the war and deterring, as Matt appropriately pointed out, deterring the war in the first place. So we're only going to need to increase this. Whether or not there's a role for NATO anywhere outside of NATO when it comes to this, I think that's a difficult question. I think the first thing I would say is let's make sure we get the NATO piece right, and let's see what we can do to increase the knowledge, the nuclear sort of understanding within the alliance that I think we'd all agree has deteriorated since the end of the Cold War. How can we build that back up and make sure that the alliance as a whole, old members, new members, understand the role of nuclear weapons in deterring aggression, and then can be a part of that as they see fit?
Here's an interesting and perceptive question, as one would expect from Bob Einhorn. The report says the two-peer problem can be addressed by adjustments in the quantity of U.S. nuclear forces, their composition, or both. That was the phraseology I read out, which I assume was drafted to enable consensus. For those supporting adjusting composition, what adjustments would meet two-peer deterrence requirements?
So some of this gets into flexibility. And have, as Matt talked about a little bit, we have the tenets, right? And part of the tenets is flexible response, tailored deterrence. And to do this in a way that makes sense, we really have to have an infrastructure in place. So we have to be able to use our infrastructure to produce whatever it is that we need. So it may not be large numbers, it may just be different things. But we need this ability to be able to address whatever it is that comes our way in the future to be able to continue to deter it. So if it's something that is a one-off, if you will, with a small number of systems, that's fine. But we need more capability in this complex across the board at DoD, at NNSA, within the industrial base to be able to address some of it. So that's a little bit on the on when we talk about how you shape the composition.
If I could also add,
Yeah.
It's
not a direct answer. Is there a direct answer? What modifications would you like to see? Maybe none of this group here is actually an advocate of doing modifications without increases, but what modifications might satisfy the requirement, might address the two-peer threat?
So I think, first of all, I think every commissioner would likely answer that in a different way. One thing that I think is important to note that all of us, despite all of us having a long history in these pieces, realize that 12 of us sitting around the table, we're not going to be able to answer the specific questions about in the future exactly what we needed, what the size, composition, the employment would be of nuclear weapons. Let's be clear, the 12 of us around the table in some point in different times have done this and maybe think we could do it, but we also recognize that's not our job. That's the job of people in place, in Stratcom, in elsewhere. The budgeting is of the people who are currently in Congress. Our job is to set out these requirements, to set out the conditions, to say these are the things you need to look at. And our job was not to tell them a point solution to something that we saw in the future, but simply to make sure people saw those same things. And as Madeline said, made decisions today that enabled decisions and choices to be made in the future?
So if you're looking for a hard answer on that one, right?
Bob Einhorn is looking for one.
Einhorn is looking for one. So think about what specific capabilities you might want, right? We're retiring the B-83 at the moment, and so that was a hard target. It has lots of issues associated with it, but what do you want to, maybe a hard target is the answer. You know, what are the hard targets you want to go after? What are the capabilities of a system and multiple systems? You know, how do you think about those specific things that you would want a capability for?
Tom Countryman has an arms control question that follows in a more erudite way, and the question I asked earlier on FOBs. I like seeking bans or limitations on technologies China's developing, fractional orbital bombardment systems and anti-satellite weapons. Is there any possibility or appetite for negotiating bans and limitations on technology in which the U.S. leads, hypersonics, BMD? If we were trying to get them to ban something that they see a value, what are we willing to put on the table in return is the question.
We spent a lot of time lamenting the fact that the opportunities for working with the Chinese leadership or Chinese military are virtually nil today, and we don't see that changing in the future, and we say that in the report. And under the current circumstances, particularly because of Ukraine, Russia seems very disinterested in talking to us as well. As a result of which, you have to go into this planning for the possibility that there will not be arms control elements that can be brought into the mix. And we say that in the report. I think the way we put it is we have to plan to be able to deter these two adversaries with or without arms control. Now, as Madeline said earlier, that doesn't mean that all possibilities are foreclosed in terms of talking with leaders from the other two countries to reduce risk. There are a lot of ways you can reduce risk. But interestingly, for example, the Chinese leadership doesn't appear interested in allowing their military to talk to our military, and I suspect I know why. You know, the fact is we could probably make some headway if our military talked to their military, and they both know what's at stake here, and they might reach some accommodations about how to reduce risk. Apparently their leadership isn't interested in allowing that. So to make it short, our report says whether we can reach these accommodations in the future or not, we've got work to do now.
And if I could add on this, one of the other things we say in the report is the first step is determining our deterrence requirements. And it's only once we've determined our deterrence requirements that then we can decide where is there room, maybe excess, that we could trade away in arms control. And kind of historically, that's the way we've done it. And so really what we're doing with this report is saying we're not where we need to be with our deterrence requirements. Where do we need to go to get there? And we think that's the first step. And once we've done that, then we can begin to design more creative arms control solutions.
Okay. I think during the Clinton administration, the Chinese did sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I think they were the second signatory, like the United States, they didn't ratify it. But in certain contexts, there may be multilateral, hence your FOBS proposal. There have been, in the past, opportunities to engage the Chinese. Here's a question. In regards to theater deployments in Asia, how are we going to convince our allies to forward deploy these weapons? What are the political leaders of countries like Japan? While the political leaders of countries like Japan may welcome this, they already have issues from their citizens who are against increased conventional military infrastructure from both the U.S. and even their own militaries. So what's your sense, particularly if you're talking about theater systems, and if you're contemplating theater systems that wouldn't be slick amend, since that the Biden administration doesn't want to pursue that, how do you address this question?
So let me just point out one interesting tidbit here. So in the Obama NPR, and I believe it was in the Trump NPR as well. I'm not sure if it's in the Biden NPR. There was a statement about exercising the ability to forward deploy. And it was exercising the ability to forward deploy using the dual capable aircraft. So not bombers, but the dual capable aircraft. And as far as I know, we haven't done that. We've never exercised that. But, so that's an option, so this is something that we could start gradually, exercise this, figure out what it would look like, how it would be received by countries where we would have these exercises. So there are ways to do this, and ways that have been supported over multiple administrations to begin to put the toe in this water.
Possibly in the context of the extended deterrence reassurance the U.S. is trying to
Exactly.
promulgate now to South Korea
Exactly.
and Japan.
Exactly.
But let's be clear, we can't do anything
no.
that if the countries aren't supportive of it. That's why you have these discussions. And these are just our recommendations about things to think about given the threat. And the countries themselves get to determine the level of threat that they feel and what they want to do. And most importantly is that we are talking to our allies together so that together we can figure out the best way to deter and make them feel comfortable in the security environment in which they operate. We're not saying anything has to be mandated. That's the great thing about having allies. We work together and they get to tell us what they're willing to accept.
In 2020, China initiated a clash with India. Those are both nuclear-armed states. And in 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Looking at this, nuclear wannabe states might assess that they should nuclearize. How active of a concern was this to the commissioners when authoring the report?
So we discussed it, but we, and pipe up here. So we discussed it, but one of the things that we focused a lot on in the context of our allies is we really talked a lot about the importance of extended deterrence and why that really is fundamentally important and why we support it. And we recognize that that's not a concept that a lot of people understand or that even a lot of people on the Hill support, because it's often viewed as something that we do for our allies when in fact it's something that we do to prevent proliferation, and there is mutual benefit to all of this. So we did look at it, we talked about it in that context for certainly.
And there is a section in the report on non-proliferation, and we say that the United States' efforts to stop the spread of nuclear weapons around the world have been effective in slowing the spread, and that the United States should continue to play that important role when it comes to non-proliferation, including with extended deterrence, dissuading our allies from developing independent nuclear arsenals because they feel confident that they can rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella.
We're down to our last few minutes. Here's a simple question which you can answer concisely. I'm sure it's the next on the list. Where might artificial intelligence play a role in the updated U.S. strategic posture? Who wants to take that on?
Everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah, everywhere, everywhere.
When we do talk about emerging technology and how that's important for a variety of different ways, including for our own forces and making sure that the United States maintains its traditional technological edge, but also how this could be potentially destabilizing with adversary capabilities that we need to be focused on that. And then also the role, as Madeline mentioned earlier, that it could play for arms control, using new technologies for verification and things like that.
But I do think it does point out, not to filibuster in this one, but it's a good opportunity for us to remind people in the report that we talked about better integrating with the civilian industry and civilian tech sector into the defense industry. And that in fact, while it used to be that all the best advances were in the defense sector and the commercial sector then took some of that, that's not what we're seeing in a lot of these places. And AI, I think, is a good example of it. That's not to say the Defense Department doesn't take advantage of that now, but also let's figure out, are there ways that we can have the cutting-edge technology from the commercial side play a part and be better able to be brought into the Defense Department and the Department of Energy, and how can we better take advantage of that?
And to work really hard to understand where it fits and where it makes sense, and frankly, to not always be so afraid of it.
Okay. According to the magic iPad, I'm down to the last 13 seconds. Does that mean we're out of questions and ready to move on to the next group? Does anybody want to cue me? I'm getting a nod. So, so I'd like to thank everyone for an interesting and collegial discussion of very difficult, perplexing issues. And at this point, this is the conclusion of this panel, but there's another very interesting one coming up shortly in just a few minutes, so just a minute or two, so don't go away.
Hi, and thank you very much for joining us for the second part of our interesting discussion on the Commission's findings on strategic posture. Our first panel really focused on what was at the heart of the report. Our second panel is going to focus on what they think about it in a discussion with some of the leading scholars on both strategic posture and non-proliferation. So directly to my left, just to reintroduce them since it's been an hour, Dr. Robert Sufer, who's a senior fellow at Forward Defense, the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. He's also the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear and Missile Defense Policy. And then we have the Honorable Walt Slocum, who's the Board Director at the Atlantic Council and the former Undersecretary for Policy at the Department of Defense. And then we have Lynn Ruston, who's the Vice President for Global Nuclear Policy Program at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Thank you all for being here with us today to share your own thoughts. And I'd just like to kick it off with a very broad question. We've just heard about the guts of the report, the findings, the recommendations, the buildup. But I want to ask you, just when you read through it, did you think that the Commission met its mark and come up with a really solid path forward? And what recommendations did you not see that you would have liked to have seen in there?
Well, I guess I'll go first. And thanks. Yes. So I think that they did meet their remit in this sense. You have to understand why the commission was created to begin with, right? So when Congress creates a commission, it means that there's an issue so politically divisive that they can't resolve it through the normal committee process, right? And so nuclear weapons is one of those, of course. And there was a previous commission chaired by Bill Perry and James Schlesinger, two former Secretaries of Defense. This was in the 2009 timeframe. And at that point, Congress was arguing over whether to build a reliable replacement warhead, robust nuclear earth penetrator. These were new nuclear systems. Really, really divisive debates that they couldn't resolve, so they appointed a commission. And the commission didn't necessarily resolve those two issues, but many of their ideas got worked into the Obama Nuclear Posture Review and had an influence, I think, in moderating that particular review. Likewise, I think what's going on here is that while there is a consensus, there has been a consensus between Republicans and Democrats to continue to modernize U.S. nuclear forces. And remember, the system that we're looking to modernize now was begun under the Obama administration, right? And then it was reaffirmed under Trump and now reaffirmed under Biden. But the big question is it enough? Is it enough, right? And so this particular posture commission found that the program of record, the replacement program, is sufficient, but it's not enough. We need to do more. And the question is how much more, okay? And now we're going to argue over how much more. And the administration has done a great job, the Biden administration, in identifying the problem, the two nuclear peer problem, the need to deter limited nuclear attacks as well as large-scale nuclear attacks. But they haven't taken the next step to determine what changes need to be done, and whether this was because they ran out of time or they're now more engaged in more pressing issues. But the thing is that this commission is going to spur them into action. They have to react. If they don't, they risk not only national security concerns, but also political concerns, because if they don't take action against the Chinese threat, we have an election coming up in 2024, right? And I can guarantee you that the Republicans will see it as an opportunity to shall I say, engage with the Biden administration over whether or not they're doing enough to meet the deterrence challenges.
First of all, I respect the commission because of the difficulty of getting people. If you know the people involved, you know that they actually don't agree on a lot of things. Then they were able to write a meaningful report covering what they could agree about, and in many cases formulations that dealt with the possibility that there were alternative views. So yeah, I have some serious criticisms. I think the first is cost. I know the argument is that it's all out in the future, but we have to anticipate expenses that come out in the future. And it is a formidable list of things, which includes, rather quietly, a conventional defense that is adequate for both theaters. And the report was published. If someone had been doing a report like this on how to deal with the conventional threat in the future, before 10 days ago, they would have said, well, we'll be cutting way back on the Middle East. We'll save a lot of money that way. So that I think in order to make meaningful judgments, you have to have some kind of a sense of what the resource requirements are going to be. And for those who are, will be people who are not in favor of doing it or doing very much. There will be people who are in favor of doing it and will do it by raising taxes, and there are people who are in favor of doing it by cutting other parts of the federal budget, and there are probably, at least in theory, people who are in favor of doing it by increasing the total amount of the GDP that goes through the government. I'm not saying it's unaffordable. Senator Kyle is absolutely right. We can afford what we need to do. It is a question of what are the other things we need to do that might be affected by this decision. Second, I think the problem about what we do in terms of the Chinese buildup, I think we're focusing on the wrong part of the Chinese buildup if we focus primarily on the additional ICBMs. I think the Chinese capability in the theater, which some of the commissioners mentioned, is a much more serious problem. I think the argument that, well, there are a lot more systems, so there are a lot more targets, gets you into the fallacy which says you define the size of the nuclear force by the number of things you could hit if you wanted to. For a long time, that drove our planning for the, it wasn't supposed to. We didn't admit it did, but in fact, it drove the planning for nuclear deterrence. Personally, I would think that it's more important for the three-party problem to emphasize survivability, a survivable force that cannot be preempted and has the capacity to, for all practical purposes, destroy the other side. That's mutual assured destruction. It is not how we plan the force, it is not how we shape the force, but it's hard to get away from the proposition that the biggest deterrent to nuclear war is uncertainty in everybody's mind about what would happen. It's all very well to talk about, well, it'll be a limited attack, and people would understand that the fact that we went over after Novosibirsk rather than, I don't know, Rostov, is very significant. But, you know, that depends on a calm judgment being made. And I think the serious question is, how do you develop a strategy and a doctrine which deals not with the ultimate attack against everything or with the essentially demonstrative attack? That the demonstrative attack is hard, but it's not as hard as what the Commission refers to as coercive. And so that, I think, is a problem. And also, Michael Quinlan, who in my opinion was probably the wisest man ever to write on these issues, said the problem of deterring nuclear war is the problem of deterring conventional war. It is, for all practical purposes, impossible to imagine a scenario in which any country would use nuclear weapons except arising out of a conventional war or a fear of an imminent conventional war. And that goes to the cost question. I mean, it's easy to say we should have a conventional defense, to have a credible conventional deterrent, you need a reasonably credible conventional defense. And I think that's a problem. I'm not saying the Commission didn't address it, but it's a somewhat harder problem, and it addresses the cost problem. I have some other comments too, but that's going on too long anyway.
Would you like to go?
Sure. So, I mean, first I want to express my deep respect for the commissioners, all of whom I know and have worked with, who have a tremendous experience in national security and obviously a deep, commitment to our country. There are things that I agreed with and a lot of things that I have questions and concerns about. I think they really got the threat assessment right, and that's very important. I really will just take a minute to say that it was really impressive and important to have this bipartisan commission really foot stomp how important it is to have U.S. global leadership and to work closely with our allies and partners. Those are really important principles at a time when there are some in our leadership who are questioning that and are kind of on a more isolationist bent. So that's really important, and they certainly emphasize that in the rollout event that I went to. It was a consensus report. I think it clearly, finessed or papered over some pretty significant different perspectives. I think one of my most important points is that, this is not the answer to the difficult question of how do we respond over the long term to the threat that's been described so well in the report. It is one input, and it's one input heavily weighted toward the military aspect of the toolkit. In some ways, it's kind of like a worst case. It's kind of a worst case defense planning document, which says if the threat environment continues on the trajectory it is now, these are the things that we need to think about. You can take issue with that even there, but what it doesn't do, and partly because it wasn't its remit from the congressional legislation, is it doesn't stand back from a wider lens and say, what are the things that we can do diplomatically through arms control, through lots of tools to actually, and frankly through our own actions, including self-restraint in some areas, to discourage or ensure or incentivize Russia and China to not go down the worst case path that they're on. So I have lots of questions, but I'll save them for
No, that's good. I was jotting down notes the whole time. I was like, oh, I want to ask about this and that. So let's start with the numbers. We have for generations now thought of mutually assured destruction and deterrence as a numbers game. If they have so many, we need to have so many. And what struck me is the shifting away from that thinking. How can we start to plan in a way that is not China is going to have 1,500, therefore we have to have X?
Well, I think, with all due respect, you've misstated the significance of assured destruction. And the term has become loaded.
Sure.
But another of Michael Quinlan's point was that nuclear weapons mean that the cost of a war can be entirely independent of who, quote, won the war. And the significance of the incredible power of nuclear weapons is that used in theory in a particular way, they would leave the initiator, the victor, vastly worse off than if they had not proceeded. And as I said, that's a physical fact. People talk about, well, we accepted assured destruction. We didn't accept it, we recognized it is a fact. Just like the law of gravity complicates airplane design. And that is the kind of ultimate foundation of deterrence, because the possibility that that's where you will end up is the biggest restraint on starting. As I said, I think the serious problem, and well, on the numbers, in my mind, yes, the Chinese buildup is very unfortunate, although from the point of view of China, why, and the Chinese, I think, will promptly say this, why are the Americans and perhaps the Russians, it's 1,500 accountable under the arms control agreement, but it's not 1,500 in reality, it's a lot more. And if you account for uploads and so on, it's still more. Why are they pretending to be so nervous about our having a force that will be maybe 20, 25%? Now, they may have the capacity to build up higher, but I think more numbers are important because it's important to show we are responding and we're doing it in useful ways. But I think the problem is much less what we do and how we think about deterrence strategy, not the kind of simple numbers that go up on a blackboard.
But having said that, you asked numbers. That's the way people in Washington think about this problem. But what if I were to suggest to you that the actual numbers that need to increase are quite modest, right? And it could be accomplished within the context of an arms control framework. So for instance, I'm just going to throw this out. You know, there's a straw man argument that people are saying that we need to add up the number of Chinese targets, the number of Russian targets, and we need to be able to match the combined amount. Nobody that I know who's been involved in this business in the government is suggesting that, okay? It's a smaller number. It could be, for instance, the treaty that existed prior to the New START Treaty was called the Moscow Treaty, and the limits there were 2,200. So let's say we go from 1,550 up to 2,200. Can we accomplish our deterrence objectives or targeting objectives by going up to 2,200? That's something that the administration would have to calculate depending on their strategy and the types of targets. But I think that maybe that's possible. And if that's the case, what if we agree with Russia to go back to that level, right? And so we've solved the China problem, both of us, and yet we haven't started an arms race.
But what I think that assumes is that you need at least 1,500. Like anything beneath that is insufficient.
Yeah, that's correct.
And that you definitely need more.
Well, that was determined back in 2010 when the Senate did its advice and consent on the New START Treaty. This is ground that has been plowed before, and that the notion that we could get by with less is I think, a non-starter. The question is more. Everybody agrees more. Well, not everybody.
I was going to say, I'd
Not
like to
everybody,
pull it in
but,
here.
but look, it's not just this commission, but the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore, the Center for International CSIS, they've done studies, bipartisan groups. They've all found that some more is needed, but we're not talking about an arms race. We can solve this problem without an arms race. But what we need is the administration to put together a package to explain to us how they would meet the requirements that the Posture Commission has laid out in a manner that does not, in fact, start an arms race. And I think that can be done.
So a couple of things. I did not find the report compelling that we need necessarily more or different nuclear forces at this time. The report is very ambiguous about what, it's actually silent on, what are the assumptions, because you're planning, you have to make some assumptions about Russia and about China. And a number one assumption, that's not hardly discussed is what will Russia be doing in the absence of arms control? And conversely, do we have an interest in constraining Russia, and at what level? And then this question of, whether we really do need any additional capability to deal with China, and when, because right now, China, as of yesterday, is assessed to have 500 nuclear weapons, not all deployed, compared to 4,000-ish below or above, for Russia and the United States. So they're not, this is something that's happening down the road and more quickly than I think anticipated a couple of years ago for sure. But we're not there yet, and so it's not laid out in the report. And another really important question I have is, the report and the commissioners have emphasized the urgency of some decisions that should be made now so that we have options available in the future, which, in principle makes sense to me, but the report was actually very unclear on specifically what are those decisions that have to be made now, because as Michael Gordon pointed out, it's definitely not about, keeping the production lines warm for strategic delivery vehicles, 15 and 20 years hence. So that's not the issue. I suspect there might be some issues in the weapons complex, but it wasn't stated. And so that sense of kind of urgency wasn't matched by a discussion of what element of this really isn't urgent. And more numbers now doesn't seem urgent to me at all. In fact, to the contrary. And can I just say one other thing, which is this goes back to the issue of just we ought to be thinking more about, and there is the chapter at the end of the report, but can we head off and mitigate the risks that we're worried about with Russia and China through diplomacy and negotiations and arms control agreements broadly defined, even a commitment at the end of New START to not exceed those limits would be a place to start. And all of that will, could obviate the need for the kinds of options that are in this report, many of which will be unachievable and too costly, not to mention destabilizing and not the path we should be going down for our security.
I suspect I know the answer to this question, but just to set a baseline, one of the report's findings is that the program of record, the modernization must continue. It's not sufficient, we heard, to meet the two-peer threat, but just to even get a baseline beyond that, we have not had a great power war for 80 years with the current arsenal. What is it about the current arsenal that is now insufficient, that is the most, I guess, biggest vulnerability that you think needs to be addressed now?
Well, for me, it's the regional aspect of the problem. So imagine that we are engaged in a war with, say, Russia in NATO. We're fighting a conventional war. We need forces there to deter limited nuclear use by the Russians, and arguably we have B-61 bombs that can be delivered by fighter aircraft in Europe, right? But what happens if while we're engaged there, China now decides to invade Taiwan? So now we've got a conventional war over there. We're still deterring nuclear use against Russia, and now we have to deter China from going nuclear. All of our nuclear assets at this point, our theater nuclear assets, are in Europe. Are you going to move some of them over to the Asian region and denude your European deterrent? You don't have to make that choice if you build some nuclear capabilities and that are dedicated to the Indo-Pacific region. If China knows that we have those capabilities, then they're less likely to engage in a war.
But that's a force structure issue. That's not a modernization issue. And
No, you have to. We don't have any nuclear force structure there, and so one of the examples, of course, is the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, where you don't have to ask the allies for their permission. But the fact that China knows that we have submarines out there that can be used promptly in a regional nuclear contingency, now they understand that there's no way that they could use limited nuclear employment and gain an advantage, get us to back down. It just adds to the deterrent effect, but it does require an additional capability. Look, to be fair, what the administration is saying is they recognize that problem, but they're saying that we have existing capabilities to deal with that. They're suggesting that perhaps you could launch a B-52 bomber with a cruise missile, get it into the region. You could maybe take tactical fighters, move them into the region, and or maybe use a submarine-launched ballistic missile with a low yield. We have those capabilities, but they are not necessarily prompt. They're not necessarily present in the region, and if they're deployed to the region, they're not survivable. But most importantly, China is building up its regional nuclear capabilities. If we do not respond to that, that sends a signal, potentially, to China that we're not willing to compete in that area, and consequently, it sends a signal to the allies that maybe we're not willing to run risks on their behalf.
Yeah, I think this last point, Rob long ago convinced me that nuclear sea-launched cruise missile is a good idea. To be honest, it's not so much because it adds military capability, although it does for all the reasons Rob outlines. One of our biggest problems in Asia is building a structure in the region that people are willing to stand up to China, because most of the Asian countries have the option of some kind of accommodation. And it's a problem we don't have to nearly the same degree in NATO. And I think one of the greatest advantages of a nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile is that it is, for all practical purposes, not necessarily, but for all practical purposes, it is an Asia-focused capability. And it would allow us, without the incredible political chaos of trying to permanently deploy American nuclear forces in Japan or the Philippines or wherever. It provides a genuine answer. It's highly survivable. It is prompt. It's very accurate. It can be made it is very accurate. It probably has as good penetration capacity as anything else. And we can point to it and say, this is the physical manifestation of our commitment to use nuclear weapons if necessary in Asia. Now, I don't necessarily believe that that would succeed in deterring a Chinese strike if for some ultimate reason they decided it was important. But in order to have a credible conventional defense with a nuclear element to it, and in order to have a political coalition in Asia that will stand up to the Chinese, in many ways, it is as important to reassure the Allies as to deter the Chinese, because they are intimately linked. And a system like this, I think, is a big contribution to doing that.
So first of all, I just want to agree with something Walt said earlier, and which the Commission also said, which is the best way to deter a nuclear war or conflict is to deter a conventional one between great powers with nuclear weapons. And that's where our focus should be. And frankly, that's, as a taxpayer, I'd rather see my added dollar go to defenses and new technologies and not to the nth nuclear weapon, which I don't think we need. Second of all, we do have capabilities. We have SLBM, submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They now, thanks to the Trump administration, when Rob was in it, have a low-yield option on those systems. We have air-delivered capability. We're investing in more long-range standoff weapons. So there's plenty of nuclear capability that can be brought to bear in the region to certainly to assure allies and also to deter China.
This is one of the points that we brought up in the first panel, but I wanted to talk about or ask your views on the recommendation about new arms control agreements and the likelihood that we could even get Russia or China to come to the table on different levels of numbers, different types of testing, the different types, the new modern bombs that China is developing. And so just, you know, given the current context of the war with Ukraine, how can you get, one, Russia to the table, and two, how would you get China to the table?
Well, first of all, I think it's a really important element of the report, and I'd like to see it amplified in that we should be looking to see whether arms control broadly defined, meaning not just legally binding agreements, but you know, cooperative arrangements, commitments, risk reduction, whether all of that can be used to you know, reduce the threat that we see currently and that could develop further. I thought the report was, you know, kind of silent on the fact about, or the question of whether it actually mattered to us anymore to try to maintain mutual restraint with Russia on strategic numbers, which I think is still important, and as a way of bounding the threat and also what we have to deal with China. And I also think it's potentially achievable, not now, clearly, but at some point the fighting in Ukraine is going to stop and the climate will change and an opportunity, I think, will arise, especially with the pending you know, expiration of New START, that there will be a desire, and I hope it's a mutual desire, to maintain some mutual limits on strategic forces. And that does need to include now the new systems that Russia's bringing online. I also share the aspiration to bring in all nuclear warheads and non-strategic warheads. I think that may be a longer-term proposition. And again, it's with China, it's an even longer. I think we're further away from arms control, but the first steps of dialogue, mill-to-mill, it needs to be pursued. But part of that is, I mean, the report talks about kind of independently establishing our requirements and then seeing what you could do with arms control. But it's really more of an iterative process because your requirements are partly determined by, you know, so for New START, it wasn't just how many weapons do we need, it's how many and what kind of weapons do we think we need if Russia will agree to these limits, and do we need more, you know, if they exceed it. And so it's not a you know, it's not a question that you answer on your own. It's a question you answer in connection with what is the other party willing to do. And it may not seem viable right now, but I think the opportunity will return in the future.
I think there is an error. Well, you only have arms control agreements or any other kind of agreements if both parties think it's in their interest. And I think one of the things we ought to do is to focus on some of the things that, some of the concerns that only nuclear superpowers can have. And one is being sure that if you use nuclear weapons, it was really, really necessary. And this is sometimes described as an accidental problem. It is, I think, much more a problem of decision-making under incredible pressure. And I think there are a number of steps which could be taken, which do not include de-alerting, which is the worst possible answer and the worst way to make the problem harder rather than easier. But there are other things that could be done. And it might be an area where you could talk seriously to both the Russians and the Chinese. There is another area which is how do you, well, let me think about how to articulate it, and I'll comment later.
Lynn wants to jump in.
I was just going to do a two-finger on that and note that the Biden administration is currently undertaking a nuclear fail-safe review. It was mandated in the National Defense Authorization Act. It's looking specifically at kind of assuring the safety, security, reliability of U.S. nuclear weapons and command and control systems to avoid inadvertent or miscalculated nuclear use. So things like looking at cyber threats or problems in the supply chains. This review should hopefully yield both some technical as well as some policy recommendations for steps the U.S. can do, many unilaterally, but also there may be some ideas for things that we could do in parallel with other states with nuclear weapons or encourage them to do on their own. Anyway, I think that's something like this was done 30 years ago. It's now being done again, and that's an example. And can I just say one other thing, which is, about the threats from the other side. There is some element of we have to ask ourselves about our own restraint and thinking about what is the reaction that our actions, even our planning, let alone our actually developing and deploying these things, will engender in the other side. The missile defense discussion is a good example of something that could be seen as very provocative to China and Russia. Everything in this report, the laundry list of items that Matt read to us, just the idea that we're planning for that can be very provocative. And I think some thought needs to go to whether, because at some point if we don't do certain things, it won't be sensible for another country to keep building up.
So I agree with Lynn that as we start to get close to the expiration of the New START Treaty in February of 26, people's minds will focus on what comes next, okay? So I think we have time to assess our deterrence requirements and build that into a proposal that we can then present to the Russians. China's not going to come to the table. Forget about a three-way talks. It's just not going to happen. Sorry to say it, but we need to figure out what our deterrence requirements are. The Russians will figure out what their requirements are, and now we have the basis for negotiation. But let's bring the politics in here again, okay? You're not going to have another treaty. Republicans are not going to agree to a follow-on New START framework unless there is some additional nuclear force capabilities. I'm not talking about 5,000 more nuclear weapons, but slick them in, for instance, and some number of uploads of the current missiles. Likewise, it's going to be difficult, I think, for the Republicans to secure administration support for these additional capabilities unless there is some arms control framework built into that, right? And there can be restraint. 2200, going back to 2200, is a constraint. The arms control community will not like the fact that we're going from 1550 to 2200, but they should like the fact that we now still have constraints.
I'd like to also, before we get to audience questions, talk about the other ways to provide deterrence through space, through cyber. Let's start with space. It's becoming a more and more critical element to detection, to potentially being able to shoot down an incoming missile. What more needs to be done in this realm to bolster strategic posture?
Well, it is probably, first of all, I assume most of the answers, interesting answers to that question are classified for very good reason. The second thing is, I think space is primarily relevant for warning and surveillance and command and control, rather than another place to put nuclear weapons. I mean, yeah, the two sides should agree not to do FOBs, because FOBs is a stupid system. Very dangerous, but also stupid. But I think we need to think a lot more, and it may well be going on in the system, on how we use space to strengthen surveillance and control and survivability and resilience of a workable command system.
You know, I go back to something Walt said about survivability of U.S. nuclear forces. I think it's the same in space. The key to stability, the key to not having to use nuclear weapons, the key to deterring the adversary from attacking you is to make sure you have the ability to respond, right? Survivable nuclear forces, now we need to have survivable space forces as well. And I think the administration, the general approach is to you know, proliferate the number of sensors that we have out there to make sure the adversary cannot conduct a first strike that would blind us, right? We're also looking at potential counter space capabilities against the other side. So this is happening, but again, the key here is going to be survivability. I don't think there's an arms control framework that solves this problem.
And the least survivable part, I think it is survivable, but the most vulnerable to disruption is not any of the nuclear systems, the platforms, it's the command and control system. The early warning, the command and the communications to the force, that I think is a place, and I understand why the commission didn't emphasize it, because there's not a heck of a lot you can say about it, but it is terribly important.
The commission spoke about missile defense. Again, that's another capability, and there's probably no issue in U.S. nuclear policy that evokes more emotion than the missile defense issue. Those who believe that missile defense is destabilizing and will cause arms races, and those that believe that it provides protection and it can deter by creating uncertainty of the attack, right? And we've had this terrible debate going on since the days of the ABM Treaty and before. To make a long story short, at the end of the Cold War, we decided we're no longer going to build homeland missile defenses against Russia and China, only against Iran and North Korea. Well, now, as the committee points out, and as the China report points out, China's building a conventional ICBM to attack the United States. So now it begs the question, would it now make sense to maybe move the needle in our homeland missile defense policy to include some limited protection against these capabilities? Of course, the other side is, well, how will the other side react to it? Well, we can explore that issue with the other side. There may be a way to do this without threatening Russia or China's nuclear retaliatory capability, which is really what they're most concerned about.
But isn't a more sophisticated conventional or nuclear defense in their theater ultimately provocative? Would we allow the same in ours?
Well, we would be deploying this on U.S. territory, right?
But this is talking about regional, like pushing forward.
Also, it's a little hard for me sitting here to figure out why it would be a good idea for a country to use an ICBM, if an ICBM means anything like what we understand it to mean today, to deliver 1,000-pound bombs. That strikes me as a remarkable non-problem. I mean, there's some vulnerabilities, and maybe you can think of point defenses, but they'd be a very different kind of defense. Among other things, you don't have to. A ballistic missile defense against nuclear weapons, which is 90% effective, is essentially not very good. Ballistic missile.
If you're protecting the homeland populations, but if you're trying to protect U.S. retaliatory forces, that's a pretty good probability of success.
Yes, up
right?
to a point.
Up to a point.
Up to a point. But I think there is a real danger that we fall back into the illusion that you're going to defend the whole force, so that defending is not the way to make a survivable force. It is to put it in places and in ways that are hard to attack rather than affirmatively defending it, and that's still true.
Can we get back to basics? I mean, the idea is that our nuclear force, strategic force, is supposed to be, first and foremost, a deterrent against use by Russia or China. And so any kind of, and the whole idea is that, you know, national missile defense, you know, is not viable against, you know, a Russian force, and we don't actually say it explicitly, but against Chinese either. And so this idea of kind of having a limited capability, I don't know what that, I don't even know what that means, because it's the idea that China or Russia would even, you know, think they could send one missile to the U.S. homeland and think that would be limited. I mean, it's just more scenarios that
It's
don't make
obviously
sense to
true
me.
that if there's no capability to defend against it, it becomes a much more feasible attack. It's more a question of the seriousness of the.
Well, I mean, it can be overwhelmed by the offense more cheaply.
But you have to ask, why is China building a conventional ICBM?
Well, that's a good question. The United States considered it, and when
So-
Matt
so
and I
I-
were in the Senate, decided that it was destabilizing and that we wouldn't do it.
It's interesting.
think-
So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, sorry.
I mean, Lynn is getting back to really the most fundamental question in this field, and that is what deters? How easy is it to deter? And I get the sense that Lynn believes that a relatively modest nuclear force that can threaten Russian or Chinese population urban areas would be sufficient for deterrence. I take a different view. I think it's much more complicated than that. I think when you're trying to extend deterrence on behalf of allies, you have to threaten to use nuclear weapons at your own risk. And why would the adversary believe that the U.S. attacking their cities would be a credible deterrent? Because if we attack their cities, they attack ours.
I didn't
And
say
so,
a word about that. I
Well,
mean,
okay, I'm sorry.
We're talking about the program of record, which is not based on that kind of targeting, right? I mean, the baseline is a program of record.
no, but you think that we can get by with fewer nuclear weapons?
Well, have
do
I
you-
said that in this forum? Right now, so far I've said, I don't see the case has been made for more.
Okay, all right.
It's a very interesting question why the Chinese would want to do that. I believe the Chinese may well exaggerate the degree to which modest damage to the American homeland would coerce us into not responding in a theater. On the other hand, if we've got any targets where an ICBM delivered high explosive weapon can knock out a important, essential capability, we better fix that problem by fixing the system, not explaining that we're going to defend against it. If the point defense is a much easier problem than area defense, and there may be options, but it just doesn't strike me on any kind of a large scale as a place to put a lot of emphasis.
Yeah. Well, the Northern Command commander is worried about attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure, the ports of embarkation.
Attacking ports with high explosive weapons is not done with one bomb, no matter how powerful.
You know,
the bomb
it would be a suite of bombs, but definitely it could be cruise missile attacks, it could be ICBMs. But if you're concerned that China and Russia may attack, say, European ports or South Korean ports or Guam, why wouldn't they also attack ports here in the United States?
Because the Americans would be furious.
No.
It would.
So I could let them keep going. I do want to get to some audience questions. So question one, does the Commission adequately address the scale of change needed in the weapons production complex to meet this evolving threat environment?
Well, I think one of the most interesting parts of the report is the proposals with respect to what is called the nuclear enterprise. That is the infrastructure that is responsible not for the platforms, which is where almost all the public debate is about platforms. In many ways, the question of the infrastructure to make sure that the weapons are safe and reliable and effective, not vulnerable, is extremely important. And I don't have anything like this, the detailed knowledge of the enterprise, but I think there are probably things in the nuclear enterprise system as a whole that do need improvement, and the Commission's list of recommendations for that certainly sounds plausible.
Yeah, and even if you weren't planning to expand the capabilities, you would still need to bolster the current infrastructure just to support the so-called program of record.
Yeah, and I would just say, I mean, I think the report was strong on that. It does strike me as the thing that is urgent to answer my own question in terms of if you, or at least urgent to keep at it and continue bringing the weapons complex up to the modern day, so that you are in a position to respond in the future if you need to. I don't know, I didn't quite know what it meant by, expanding the capacity. I think we've got our hands full with just, being able to bring the complex up to date to do what we're doing now. But certainly that's important, and it's always underinvested in. In Congress, it's, people are more interested in the next widget, the next weapon, the next delivery vehicle more than they are in the facilities that are, and the people. Actually, the report makes a really strong case for the investment in our scientific and industrial base and the personnel, and all of that's so important. And,
I think one of the biggest problems is to attract brilliant young scientists to be willing to work on nuclear problems, and that's, if you don't have that, you face much more difficult problems, and that goes back to the whole basic question of how do we support education and science in this country? How do we build trust in scientists? Whether we make it an attractive field for people to work who have the scientific, technical capability to work there.
So, Lynn, there's a question for you. You said you need to find ways to incentivize China and Russia on arms control to reduce this threat. The question is, how do you do this while balancing adversaries' own security and the U.S. negotiating leverage?
well, that's
It's
a
a
good
simple
question. Look, it's hard, but I mean, I think, I do think historically, and again, Russia's doing anomalous things right now, so we don't know what the future direction of Russia will be. But historically, they have found it in their mutual interest, as we have for over 50 years, to maintain, mutual limits on our strategic forces. I think the Russians are still interested in that. It's a more complicated negotiation because there are other capacities with strategic effect that we know they want to bring into the conversation. We want to bring in more systems, but I still think there's that overarching mutual interest. And I think the opportunity will open up to get back to the table with Russia. And again, legally binding verifiable agreements are the gold standard, but there are other options short of that. China is going to be tougher because they're in a different place, but I think I agree. I think we need to, I don't think we should still be pursuing bilateral constraints with Russia, even as China is building and we're trying to establish dialogue with them. But I don't think it's a three-party negotiation realistically. And I don't think we should be letting Russia run free because, all the second graders are running to the soccer ball, which is China. But meanwhile, it is Russia that still has more than 4,000 nuclear weapons. So we can't take our eye off that ball.
Rob, did you have something you want to say on the incentives? Or?
No, I would just be repeating myself again. I agree with Lynn that we probably should engage the Russians, put everything on the table, but at the end of the day, it can't be just about extending the current framework. That's just not, even this administration has agreed that the next round of discussions with the Russians have to include the novel systems. They have to include the non-strategic systems. It's got to be included. And now the Commission is recommending that we're going to need some, I'm going to use the word modest, increase in our strategic forces. Let's bake it all in, start negotiating with the Russians, and see where this turns out.
So we have a SLCM question. With a fielded SLCM capability on U.S. attack subs, how would China be able to differentiate between a conventional and nuclear cruise missile during a crisis?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter in this sense, right? Because the assumption is that they'll see cruise missiles coming at them and they'll think that they're nuclear weapons, so then they'll launch their own nuclear weapons. Look, during this crisis, the Chinese forces will be on alert. They will be dispersing their forces. There's no way that 1 or 2 U.S. cruise missiles heading to China is going to be misconstrued as a disarming first strike. They can actually wait to see where the nuclear where the cruise missile hits, determine whether it's nuclear or not, and then respond. There's no reason for them to have to
And
to
the,
use
they
their.
would wait?
the
Yeah, they
problem,
would wait. Look, we're going to be attacking them with conventional cruise missiles. Just because they see a
Yeah.
cruise missile coming at them, you think they're going to respond with nuclear weapons? That makes no
also-
sense.
Also, the problem is not limited to cruise missiles. We plan to use B-52 bombers, which strangely enough were designed almost before I was born. We have all kinds of fighter aircraft that are nuclear capable, and it's hard to tell which ones are nuclear capable. This problem, I think, is overstated. The problem of seeing an attack on the homeland coming out of nowhere, I think, is overstated too, but there are ways to deal with that.
And did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I think discrimination of dual capable systems is something to be concerned about, and
Yeah.
Just out of my own curiosity, what did you think of the Commission's recommendation on a mobile Sentinel program and the potential risk or advantages it might bring?
Well, the Clinton administration tried that. The enthusiasm for robust national defense does not seem to apply in sparsely populated parts of our country. I think that there's a NIMBY issue, which is real. And I think there are better ways to, I mean, we should look at the options for some kind of a mobile system. We thought we had one, but nobody seemed to like it very much. But it strikes me as a very hard way to approach the survivability problem. Maybe as an adjunct to, relatively small, highly survivable force. But with modern surveillance technology, it's not clear how we would make it survivable. I mean, supposedly, we have a lot of, and no longer have the access to be sure about this, but supposedly we worry about the opposition's ability to track things that are moving, and presumably believe we have a pretty good possibility of tracking.
Anyone want?
I'll just two things. I mean, so, mobile missiles theoretically, are more survivable. I mean, they are, although you've just pointed out that there's challenges to that too. But politically, to me, it seems like a complete non-starter. I can't imagine that people want to start seeing mobile missiles be remote, although maybe it would be good because it would remind the American people who are kind of blissfully unaware that we have nuclear weapons and that they're that we have a lot, and so do other countries. But anyway, I think it's completely a non-starter. I just can't imagine having a road mobile, a rail mobile system. But can I just say one other thing, which is I do not see the wisdom from a strategic stability standpoint of uploading our ICBMs, and the report does call for adding more warheads. Right now, they're all single warhead. Adding more warheads to and also planning to do that on the next generation, the Sentinel. I mean, it's the leg of the triad that's the least stabilizing. It's just not where I'd add more weapons.
First, on the mobile, again, I think it speaks to survivability. We had a debate over this during the Cold War. I understand that, but things are different now with the two nuclear peer environment. But look, you're not talking about nuclear weapons roaming the countryside. These things will be based in garrison, and during a crisis they would be flushed out.
That's the one we couldn't sell. So Good
Well,
luck to you.
But let's toss it in the mix. Let's figure it out.
Okay.
Look, if part of the response to this two nuclear pair problem is we may need more nuclear weapons, or we may need to make the existing force more survivable, or some combination of the two. Instead of adding another 150 Sentinels, if you make 150 more survivable, maybe that achieves the same objectives.
Well, we are at our final minute, so I just wanted to offer the opportunity for any closing thoughts that, or something that you'd wished to be able to raise before we conclude.
I'm sorry, I think this uncertainty is creating a lot of friction. We need the administration to take on the recommendations of this commission and try to think about how they would react to that, whether it's slick them in or some other theater capability, some additional nuclear forces that can be packaged in an arms control framework. Let's get a position on the table, and then we can have a more logical debate over this.
I guess I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
You
Yeah,
got
then
20
I'll
seconds.
get the last word,
Okay.
but be short.
Only that I think one of the things the commission report does is to bring to an admittedly limited and specialized group a kind of focus on these issues. And one of the remarkable things is Rob made a real contribution to this in the Defense Department. We have a pretty good consensus in this country on supporting a very ambitious, a very strong, very survivable nuclear force, and maintaining this as a subject that people understand, and also that isn't wildly divisive, like ABMs. ABMs are an article of faith as much as anything else.
I have to apologize,
And-
we are out of time. We're actually over time,
We're not
but I have a
sorry.
feeling this panel could keep
I should
talking
not
about
have
this.
deferred.
Just everyone, thank you very much for attending, and all of you, thank you for your expertise.
Thank you.
I tried.
I shouldn't have deferred.
Never get